If I was about to forget every comic story I'd ever read, but could first record a message for myself just before the mind wipe, this would be the result.
You're a wonderful man, and you're so
Condor Man. Hey, I'm Peter Franson from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. Welcome to Essential Issues, where I talk about my favorite DC comics of the past that are still affordably available today, blabbing about why they're special to me and what, if anything, they have to say about the essential issues of real life. Now, I gotta say, as a warning, this series will freely contain spoilers, but I think even spoiled, the stories I feature are still well worth reading. For more info about the intent of this series and what to expect from it, check out the video on the Christian Geek Central YouTube channel titled Essential Issues Series Introduction. Alright, at long last, this time around, I'm going to present my pick for the essential origin story of my favorite comic book character, Green Lantern. Now, Jeff Johns did a cool modern retelling of Hal Jordan's origin in a storyline called Green Lantern's Secret Origin. I love a lot about that storyline, but it lacks, I think, some focus as a self-contained story, instead kind of veering off into little rabbit trails that are more for existing Green Lantern fans familiar with Hal Jordan and his supporting cast. It sheds interesting light on the past of a character the reader already knows, rather than serving as the purest intro, I think, to the character. For that, my pick is the classic Green Lantern Emerald Dawn. Originally published in 1989 and 1990, it's still easily available as a trade paperback, and it's been recolored as well. I'm going to be showing images, if you're watching the video version of this, from my old and well-worn and loved 1990s trade paperback, which maybe I'm seeing it through nostalgic eyes, but I still think it looks great. Alright, so issue 1 does start a little bit too poetic for my tastes. The opening narration boxes read, "It begins as a distant thunder rolling across the heavens with a storm warning's clamor. It swells to envelop the firmament in a grand exclamation. It climaxes with the stentorian bark of an angry god. It then retreats in the same subtle fashion with which it arrived, leaving in its wake the brightest day." And, you know, it sounds nice. I guess it kind of rolls off the tongue in a nice way, but it's never really clear what it refers to. So it just kind of sets a tone doing what it does, rather than saying much of value to the story, I think. And the tone, I gotta say, is really solid for my taste, given that it's a comic book of the late 80s and early 90s, you know. It takes its time and has quiet, cinematic vibes to it, especially to the opening pages as we're introduced to Hal Jordan as a child who watches his father pilot a jet that ultimately crashes on the runway, taking his father's life. Then we flash forward and Hal is growing up and himself a test pilot like his father, but also very reckless and irresponsible. While heavily intoxicated, he drives his friends home from a bar, but ends up crashing and causing serious harm to his passengers. He is demoted at work, limited to running test flights in a simulator, and he feels bitter and mistreated, totally unwilling to take responsibility for his actions. And yet, he is whisked away by a strange green energy delivered to the crash site of a dying alien, and told he has been chosen to replace him as the Green Lantern of Sector 2814. Why? Because he has the ability to overcome his own fear, a vital requirement of every Green Lantern. But Hal is still very flawed, and he knows that he is, even though he hasn't dealt with his responsibility issues yet. In fact, the issue ends with him flying straight into a road sign that he blames for the car accident that in actuality he caused. Right from the start, as I came back to these issues for the first time in like 10 or 15 years, I noticed how the storytelling was holding up for me. It's still a little dated here and there, but it's largely past the awkward expositional dialogue that was all over comics of the 80s. The artist, M.D. Bright, is one of my favorite Green Lantern artists. He often adds explosive, blooming clouds to the Ring's energy constructs that makes them seem alive to me somehow. He hasn't done Green Lantern art for a long time, as far as I know, so it's a real treat for me to come back to his art in this story. The overall tone of Emerald Dawn is less Saturday morning and leans more toward, I think, prime time television, with more grown-up elements than I would expect from older comics, and a more subtle storytelling style that doesn't spoon-feed everything to you, especially when it comes to who Green Lanterns are. We're learning all of this slowly, right along with Hal as he experiments with the Ring's capabilities and stumbles through trial and error. In issue number 2, we're introduced to Legion, the giant yellow robotic-looking creature that hunted Hal's predecessor and now hunts for him. Again, we aren't spoon-fed anything. Who this creature is and what he has against Green Lanterns is a mystery. Meanwhile, Hal starts coming to terms with his guilt and responsibility. Running from it was only causing him more problems, and so he faces the consequences head-on. He's not a new man, and still doesn't think ahead effectively, but it's a step in his character development, and I really appreciate that kind of thing. But when Legion tracks Hal to the jail that he's in, Hal can't afford to pay for his crime just yet, and he has to figure out how to use the Ring and stop this creature from killing everybody. In the process, he learns more about the Ring, about its former owner, and how he arrived on Earth. Pieces are slowly coming together for Hal and for us as readers. As the story progresses, Hal connects with other Green Lanterns and continues showcasing his reckless personality, but there is little time for correction and training because Legion is now the concern of all Green Lanterns. Things slow down just a little as the Green Lanterns consult the Book of Oa, which provides some of the backstory for Legion, but thankfully not all at this point, and leaves some mystery for us to speculate on for now. The writing doesn't get too philosophical, mostly sticking to upholding order and justice as the foundational purpose of the Green Lantern Corps. But once again, we see this idea that someone can atone for their own sins. It's being perpetuated as a fellow Green Lantern tells Hal that he can atone for the accident he caused that harmed his friends. He can atone for that through actions that he takes now in his new life as a Green Lantern. Now, this doesn't work in reality, atoning for our own sins, because if we can really choose between good and evil, then we owe it to our Creator to choose good every time, which means that we can't sin on Monday and make up for it with perfect obedience on Tuesday, because we already owe God perfect obedience on Tuesday. We need someone external to us to truly and fully make up for the wrongs we've done. Finally, Hal does get a little bit of training. At this point, he is more humble and recognizes his need to grow in wisdom. But again, he's still Hal. He's still flawed. We see that all the way to the end of this story. In issue 5 out of 6 in this trade paperback, things really cut loose with Legion on the Green Lantern home planet of Oa, and Legion's just waging war against basically every Green Lantern on the planet. Still very much himself, Hal recklessly takes Legion on single-handedly against the wishes of the Guardians, which, if you don't know, the Guardians are kind of like the big bosses, the creators and overseers of the Green Lantern Corps. And Hal is just, being reckless, improvising as he goes along, and coming up with some clever ideas at the same time. Hal Jordan's long-standing authority kind of trait is on full display here, and it's actually rewarded a bit by the storyteller. So thematically, Hal's willfulness is treated as both a weakness and as a strength. Now, that's a familiar idea in fiction that maybe feels complex on the surface. I mean, it makes for a more interesting character. I prefer it over a writer exclusively using a character to trumpet freedom, or exclusively using a character to trumpet submission. But what is usually never explored is the nuanced issue of when it is a virtue to be willful and when it is a virtue to be submissive. And I think that's because the particulars depend on a particular moral code, which mainstream fiction writers hesitate often to state clearly, or they'll just use some purely man-made moral codes when they do that are just kind of a mess. Moral issues aside, though, I like the fact that Hal is a pretty well-defined character here, with both strengths and serious flaws. And then things get crazy near the end of this story, as Legion is revealed to be something much more dangerous and horrifying than he appeared for most of the story. And to match that horrifying power, Hal has to do something reckless, something no Green Lantern has ever done. And it leads to one of the most memorable moments in my comic book reading history for me. One thing I love about DC's characters is how powerful they tend to be. So much so that they're led to question their humanity in some circumstances. And there's a moment like that in the climax of Emerald Dawn that just made me see the potential power level of this character. This normal guy who once described his ring as a conduit to infinity that's just sitting there on his third finger. I mean, what a great juxtaposition of just the mundane and the absolutely cosmic level power, It's that crazy level of power given to a normal guy that makes Green Lantern so fascinating to me, and that's certainly put on display in this trade paperback. Something I don't want to neglect mentioning about this story is the theme. There's a theme of basically taking responsibility for your actions. Hal starts out this story not wanting to take responsibility for his reckless actions. Eventually, he has to come to terms with his guilt and his blame and deal with the consequences of that. And on the back half, you almost might not even notice it, but the Guardians of the Universe also try to kind of dodge responsibility, in effect, for the consequences that brought about Legion. And they're kind of like, this is the beginning of Hal Jordan calling them to account, which he will do many times after this in his history as a part of the Green Lantern Corps. And so taking responsibility for one's actions, a major theme of this, and something that I think is really good for us as geeks to reflect on. Sometimes it can be so easy when we feel like the world is kind of against us and doesn't understand us to kind of default to being in a victim mode when there may be some responsibility on our part that has added to the mess that we're experiencing. And so I think a story like this is a good enough reason as any to give that some thought. You can get Green Lantern Emerald Dawn now on Amazon for between $10 and $20, sometimes even less than that if you're interested. That's all I've got to say for now. Man, if you check it out, I hope you enjoy it half as much as I have. Stay tuned for more Essential Issues. Next time I plan to present my pick for the essential origin story of probably my second favorite superhero, The Flash.
christiangeekcentral.com